There are moments that reshape you so quietly you don't realize they're happening until they've already passed. Standing in Nolan's hallway that night, my coat heavy in my hands, I thought I was just leaving. I thought I was doing what friends do when the evening ends and the comfortable distance between us needed to be restored. I had no idea I was standing at the edge of everything changing. The apartment felt different that night. Smaller, somehow. The walls seemed to hold our conversation closer, every word we'd shared settling into the corners like dust. I could smell the faint scent of his laundry detergent mixed with the lingering warmth of dinner we'd shared hours earlier. The hallway stretched behind me toward his bedroom, and ahead of me, the front door waited like an ultimatum. Nolan stood against the kitchen counter, barefoot, wearing that gray hoodie he'd had since college. The one with the frayed cuffs that he pulled over his hands when he was thinking. His dark hair was slightly mussed, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite name. Not sadness, exactly. Not regret. Something more complicated than that. He looked at me for what felt like a long time before he spoke. "You probably shouldn't stay tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It'll just make things harder." The words hung in the air between us like a confession we weren't ready to make. I understood what he meant without him having to explain. There had been something building between us for months now, something neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It lived in the space between casual touches, in the way our conversations had started lasting longer, in how we'd begun finding excuses to see each other more often. I nodded because that's what you do when someone tells you a truth you don't want to hear but can't argue with. "Of course," I said, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Of course he was right. Staying would complicate things. Staying would mean we'd have to face whatever this was that kept pulling us toward each other despite every rational reason to maintain our carefully constructed friendship. I slipped my arms into my coat sleeves, the familiar weight of it settling on my shoulders like armor. Nolan watched me, his hands still hidden in his hoodie pockets, and I could feel him wanting to say something else. But he didn't. We'd gotten good at not saying things, at letting silence do the work our words couldn't manage. I reached for the door handle, my fingers closing around the cool metal. For a moment, I paused. Part of me wanted to turn around, to ask him what he really meant, to push past the careful boundaries we'd built around whatever this was between us. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the door and stepped into the night. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and clean after the warmth of his apartment. October in the city carried a particular kind of chill, the kind that cut through your clothes and reminded you that winter was coming whether you were ready or not. I walked to my car, my footsteps echoing against the pavement in the empty parking lot. The streetlights cast long shadows, and everything felt heightened, more real somehow, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, and I stared ahead at nothing in particular. This was how it always ended, I told myself. This was how it was supposed to end. We'd spend an evening together, comfortable and easy, and then we'd return to our separate lives. That was what friends did. That was what we'd always done. But something felt different tonight. Something in the way he'd looked at me, in the careful way he'd chosen his words. Something in what he hadn't said. I turned the key, but before I could shift into drive, something made me look back. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the part of me that had been paying attention to all the things we didn't say to each other. The light was still on in his living room window. I could see the warm glow spilling out into the darkness, and for a moment, I imagined him still standing in his kitchen, still thinking about whatever had made him tell me I shouldn't stay. That's when I noticed it. The front door. It wasn't closed. Not wide open. Nothing dramatic or obvious. Just slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two. Enough that someone looking might notice. Enough that someone who was meant to see it would understand. I sat there in my car, engine running, staring at that narrow strip of light between the door and the frame. It could have been nothing. It could have been carelessness, the door not quite catching when I closed it behind me. But somehow I knew it wasn't. Somehow I knew that Nolan had opened it again after I left. Had stood there in his hallway, thinking the same thoughts I was thinking, wanting the same thing I was wanting but couldn't name. The door was an invitation written in the language we developed over months of not quite saying what we meant. It was permission and possibility and fear all at once. It was Nolan's way of saying that maybe he was wrong about me leaving. Maybe making things harder wasn't the worst thing that could happen. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous, filled with the weight of a choice I wasn't sure I was brave enough to make. Through my windshield, I could see that strip of light, steady and patient, waiting for me to decide what it meant. Some doors close behind you, and that's the end of the story. Others stay open just long enough for you to realize the story isn't over yet. That maybe it's just beginning. To understand that moment in the car, staring at his door left ajar, you have to understand the 4 years that led us there. You have to know how carefully we built this thing between us, brick by brick, never quite naming what we were constructing. I'm a photographer, which means I spend my life looking for moments that matter. I notice the way light falls across someone's face when they're not paying attention. I see the exact second when a laugh becomes genuine instead of polite. It's made me careful with people, observant in ways that sometimes feel like a burden. I remember birthdays because I write them down. I stay late at parties to help clean up because I notice when the host looks overwhelmed. I rarely say how much I feel because I've learned that most people aren't ready for that kind of honesty. Nolan is different. He's a software consultant, which sounds technical and cold until you meet him. Then you realize he's the person everyone calls when their day goes wrong, when they need someone to make them laugh, when they need to be reminded that the world isn't entirely serious. He has this way of making sarcasm feel like affection, of being effortlessly warm without ever seeming to try. People lean on him constantly, and he lets them, though I've noticed he never quite knows how to lean back. We met 4 years ago at Sarah's wedding. You know how it is at weddings. Everyone gets assigned to tables based on some mysterious algorithm of social connections and ages. Nolan and I ended up at what he immediately dubbed the misfit table, surrounded by Sarah's college roommate, who'd just gotten divorced, her cousin who worked nights and looked like he'd rather be sleeping, and 2 coworkers who barely knew anyone else there. I remember thinking he had kind eyes and hands that moved when he talked. He kept making quiet observations about the wedding that were just sharp enough to be funny without being mean. When the band played their 3rd slow song in a row, he turned to me and said, "I think they're trying to tell us something about the staying power of love." The way he said it, dry but not cynical, made me pay attention. We ended up talking through most of the reception. About photography, about code, about how weddings always make you think about the relationships in your own life. When the night ended, he asked for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation. But he never called it a date, and neither did I. Since then, we've built something I've never quite known how to categorize. Movie nights where we end up talking through half the film. Long drives to nowhere in particular, windows down, music low. Inside jokes that accumulate over months until we have our own private language. Weekend trips to visit his sister or explore some small town I want to photograph. The kind of friendship that feels essential, like a piece of infrastructure you don't realize you depend on until it's gone. We've never kissed. Never touched beyond the kind of contact that passes for normal between close friends. Playful shoves when one of us says something ridiculous. Hugs that last a few seconds longer than they probably should. But the closeness between us is unmistakable. It lives in the way he saves funny articles to text me throughout the week, in how I automatically buy 2 coffees when I stop for one in the morning, just in case he comes by, in the comfortable silences that stretch between us when we're both reading on his couch. I've loved him quietly for most of those 4 years. Not the desperate, consuming kind of love that demands confession, but something steadier and more patient. I learned to fold it into our friendship, to let it exist alongside everything else we share without asking it to be more. It became part of the architecture of my life, like learning to accommodate a chronic ache that never quite goes away, but never quite heals either. But lately, something has been shifting. Nolan calls more often, sometimes just to hear about my day. He looks at me longer when he thinks I'm not paying attention, and when I catch him, he doesn't look away as quickly as he used to. His touches linger now, a hand on my shoulder when he passes behind my chair, fingers that brush mine when we reach for the same thing. Small changes, but I noticed small changes for a living. Last month, we were watching something forgettable on his couch, and I fell asleep somewhere during the second act. When I woke up, my head was on his shoulder and his arm was around me. And he was still awake, just looking down at me with an expression I couldn't read. He didn't move away when my eyes opened. We stayed like that for several more minutes, not speaking, not acknowledging what was happening, just existing in that space between friendship and something else. Sitting in my car that night, looking at his door left open like a question mark in the darkness, I wondered if what we'd built over 4 years was still just friendship, or if it had become something else entirely, something that was waiting for one of us to be brave enough to choose it. The door seemed to suggest that maybe Nolan was wondering the same thing. Remembering all of this while sitting in my car that night, I realized the evening had started like so many others, with Nolan needing something and me being the person he called. It was just after 7 when my phone rang. I was editing photos in my apartment, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of adjusting light and shadow, when I heard his name announced by my phone's robotic voice. I almost didn't answer. Tuesday nights were usually my catch-up nights, time to organize the week's shoots and respond to client emails. But I answered anyway, because it was Nolan. His voice sounded frustrated in that particular way that meant something mechanical had betrayed him. "My car won't start," he said, "and it's pouring out here. I'm at the office and my battery's completely dead. I know it's late, but would you mind?" I was already reaching for my keys before he finished the sentence. "Give me 15 minutes, I told him. The rain was coming down in sheets when I pulled up to his building. He emerged from the lobby hunched against the weather, jacket pulled over his head, and ran to my passenger side. When he climbed in, he brought the smell of rain and something warmer, his cologne mixed with the scent that was just him. "Thanks," he said, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. "I owe you dinner for this." "You don't owe me anything," I said, though part of me liked the idea of him thinking he did. The drive to his apartment took longer than usual. The rain made everything slower, more careful. We talked about his work, about a client who couldn't decide what they wanted, about my latest project photographing a local band. Normal conversation, the kind we'd had hundreds of times before. But something felt different. Maybe it was the confined space of the car, or the intimacy of him needing help, or just the way the streetlights reflected off the wet windshield. But the air between us felt charged. When we reached his place, he asked if I wanted to come up for a few minutes. "Just until the rain lets up," he said, though we both knew I had a covered parking spot and the rain wouldn't keep me from driving home. I said yes anyway. His apartment was warm and slightly messy in the way that felt lived in rather than careless. There were dishes in the sink, a book open face down on the coffee table, his work laptop still glowing on the kitchen counter. He offered me leftover pasta from the night before, and we ate standing in his kitchen, sharing the container between us, talking about nothing important. After we finished eating, he suggested we watch something. We'd done this countless times before, settled onto his couch with whatever was on Netflix, half watching while we talked. But that night felt different from the moment we sat down. He chose a movie we'd both seen before, some thriller that neither of us needed to pay attention to. I settled into my usual spot on the left side of his couch, and he took his place on the right. But within the first 10 minutes, the space between us had somehow disappeared. It started small. His knee bumped mine when he shifted position. His arm brushed against mine when he reached for his water glass. Normal contact, the kind that happened when two people shared a small couch. But instead of pulling away, we stayed close. His thigh pressed gently against mine, and I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of our jeans. He laughed more easily than usual that night, turning to face me when something amused him, his eyes bright in the flickering light from the television. When a particularly ridiculous action sequence played out on screen, he made a joke about the physics being completely wrong, and when I laughed, he watched my face like he was memorizing it. By the time the credits rolled, we'd somehow shifted even closer. My shoulder was against his, and I could feel him breathing. The movie ended, but neither of us moved to change the channel or suggest something else to watch. We just sat there in the blue glow of the screen, not quite touching, but not quite separate either. That's when I made the comment that changed everything. Looking at the time on his cable box, seeing it was nearly midnight, I said something about maybe just crashing on his couch rather than driving home so late. I meant it as a joke, the kind of casual comment friends make. But the moment the words left my mouth, everything shifted. Nolan went completely still beside me. He turned to look at me, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before. Careful and uncertain and almost afraid. "You probably shouldn't stay tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It'll just make things confusing." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with everything we'd never said. I understood immediately what he meant, what he was afraid of. This thing between us, this careful friendship we'd built, would become something else if I stayed. Something we couldn't take back. "I don't want to confuse you," I said, trying to keep my voice light, though my heart was suddenly racing. He walked me to the door, and I put on my coat with hands that weren't quite steady. Just before I stepped into the hallway, he said something so quietly I almost missed it. "I'll leave the door open," he said, "just in case." I didn't turn around to ask what he meant. I didn't ask if he wanted me to come back, or if he was warning me away. I just stepped into the cold night, knowing that everything between us had just changed, and I had no idea what came next. I drove home that night, but I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my heart doing something between racing and aching, replaying every moment from the evening. The way Nolan had looked at me when I mentioned staying over. The careful way he'd chosen his words. The door left open like a question I didn't know how to answer. I kept thinking about what he'd said, that staying would make things confusing, as if they weren't already confusing, as if we hadn't been dancing around something for months, maybe years, pretending that the way we looked at each other was normal, that the way I felt when he was close was just friendship. Morning came gray and uncertain. I made coffee and checked my phone, half expecting some kind of message that would help me make sense of what had happened. Instead, there was nothing until almost noon, when a text from Nolan appeared that made everything somehow both clearer and more complicated. "Thanks for last night. Sorry if I was weird." I stared at those words for a long time. Sorry if I was weird. As if uncertainty was something to apologize for. As if admitting that staying over would confuse things was somehow wrong instead of honest. I started to type a response several times. "It's okay. You weren't weird." Or maybe something more direct. "What did you mean about leaving the door open?" But every response felt either too casual or too intense, so I said nothing. I set my phone aside and tried to focus on work, editing photos from a shoot the week before, but my concentration kept drifting. Days passed like that. A careful silence stretched between us, not angry but uncertain. I wondered if he was waiting for me to respond, if my silence was being interpreted as rejection or confusion of my own. I wondered if I should have walked back through that door when I had the chance. Then, 4 days later, he showed up at my apartment. I heard the knock and knew somehow it was him before I opened the door. He stood in my hallway holding 2 coffee cups from the place down the street, looking like he hadn't been sleeping well either. His hair was slightly disheveled, and there were shadows under his eyes that made him look younger and more vulnerable than usual. "Can I come in?" he asked. I brought coffee, and apologies. We sat at my kitchen table, and he fidgeted in a way I'd rarely seen from him. Nolan was usually composed, steady, the kind of person who made others feel calm. But that morning he kept shifting in his chair, his fingers drumming against the side of his coffee cup. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. "I feel like I'm supposed to have this figured out, but I don't. Sometimes I feel like I'm not supposed to want what I want." The honesty in his voice made something in my chest tighten. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to tell him that wanting wasn't something that required permission. But I'd learned to be careful with moments like this, to listen more than I spoke. "What do you want?" I asked quietly. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd been hoping to see for months. Fear, yes, but also longing. The same careful hunger I'd been carrying around. "You," he said simply. "I want you. But I don't know how to want that without ruining everything we already have." I understood then why he'd told me not to stay, why he'd left the door open, why he'd been apologizing for being weird. He was trying to protect us both from the possibility that this, whatever this was, might not survive being named. We talked for 2 hours that morning. Carefully, cautiously, like people learning a new language. He told me about lying awake thinking about what would have happened if I'd come back through the door. I told him about the 4 years of folding my feelings into our friendship, about learning to love him quietly. When he left, he asked if I wanted to come over for dinner the next night. Just like we'd done dozens of times before, except everything felt different now, more fragile and more possible all at once. So began a new pattern. Nolan would invite me over, and we'd spend the evening together, cooking, watching movies, talking about everything except the conversation we'd had in my kitchen. And at the end of each night, he'd walk me to the door and say I probably shouldn't stay. But the door was always left open. It became a ritual we both understood but neither acknowledged. The invitation to leave, followed by the invitation to return. His way of giving me permission without having to ask for what he wanted. My choice, made new each time. 3 weeks into this careful dance, I made a different choice. Instead of going to my car, instead of sitting in the parking lot looking up at his window, I stepped back through the door he'd left open. He was still in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner, when he heard me come back in. He turned, and the look on his face was equal parts relief and terror. I walked to his bedroom and sat on the edge of his bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. When he appeared in the doorway, I looked up at him and said the thing I'd been thinking for weeks. I don't want to sleep in the hallway anymore. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't make me explain or justify or convince him. He just walked to the other side of the bed and pulled back the blanket, quietly, like he'd been waiting for me to say exactly that. Neither of us moved to close the distance between us right away. We just lay there in the dark, finally in the same space, learning what it felt like to stop leaving. We lay there in the dark for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Both of us hyper-aware of the space between our bodies. The bed was wide enough that we weren't touching, but I could feel the heat radiating from him, could hear the careful rhythm of his breathing. Every small movement he made, shifting his weight, adjusting his pillow, seemed amplified in the darkness. I'd imagined this moment countless times over the years, but it was nothing like what I'd expected. I thought it would be desperate or urgent, that all the careful restraint we'd practiced would finally break apart into something wild and consuming. Instead, it felt sacred, fragile, like we were both afraid that moving too quickly might shatter whatever courage had brought us here. Nolan's voice came out of the darkness, so quiet I almost missed it. I've been thinking about what it would be like to kiss you. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt my heart stop and then start again, harder. For years of wondering, of careful glances and almost moments. And here was the confession I'd never quite let myself hope for. And I whispered, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever he might say next. I think it'd ruin me if you didn't kiss me back. The vulnerability in his voice was so raw it made my chest ache. I could hear the fear there, the same fear that had been keeping us in this careful dance for months. The fear that this thing between us might be one-sided, that crossing this line might cost us everything we'd built. I turned toward him in the darkness, moving slowly, giving him time to pull away if he needed to. But he didn't. Instead, he turned to face me too, and suddenly we were closer than we'd ever been. Close enough that I could feel his breath against my face, close enough to see the outline of his features in the dim light filtering through his bedroom window. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and placed it over his heart. It was pounding so hard I could feel it through his shirt, matching the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. I said, my voice barely audible. I would kiss you back. We stayed like that for a moment, my hand on his chest, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. I could feel him trying to decide whether to believe me, whether to trust that this was real and not just some elaborate form of pity or confusion. Then, slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand to touch my face. His fingers traced along my cheek, tentative and wondering, like he was memorizing the shape of me. When his thumb brushed across my lower lip, I felt something inside me break open. Not break apart, but break open, like a door I'd been keeping locked finally swinging wide. The kiss, when it finally happened, was nothing like the urgent, passionate moments I'd imagined. It was soft and questioning, a conversation conducted in the language of touch. His lips were warm and slightly uncertain against mine, and I could taste the faint sweetness of the wine we'd shared with dinner hours earlier. We pulled apart after only a few seconds, both of us breathing harder, both of us staring at each other in wonder and terror. Then Nolan exhaled, and it was a sound I'd never heard from him before, relief and longing and something that sounded almost like grief. I didn't want to admit how much I needed that, he whispered. I pressed my forehead against his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight dampness where we'd both started to sweat despite the cool air in his bedroom. Our noses bumped, and I could feel him smiling in the darkness. Then don't make me leave again, I said. It wasn't a request or a demand, just a statement of what I hoped might be possible now. That maybe this careful dance we'd been doing, these months of almost touching and never quite saying, could finally transform into something more solid, something we could both hold on to. He kissed me again then, and this time it was deeper, more certain. His hand tangled in my hair, and I pulled him closer, finally allowing myself to want him without reservation. We kissed like people who had been holding their breath for years and were finally remembering how to breathe. When we broke apart, we stayed close, our breathing synchronized, our bodies finally relaxed in a way they hadn't been all evening. Nolan's arm came around me, and I settled against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heartbeat. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, he said into the darkness above our heads. I pressed a kiss to his collarbone, tasting salt and warmth and something that was uniquely him. If you do, I said, come find me. We fell asleep like that, tangled together, his hand in my hair and my arm across his chest. For the first time in 4 years, I slept through the night without dreaming about what it would be like to be exactly where I was. When morning came, filtering gray and gentle through his bedroom window, we were still holding each other, still breathing in the same rhythm, still choosing, with every moment we didn't pull away, to stay. Morning arrived quietly, the way it does when you wake up somewhere that isn't quite home but feels like it could be. I opened my eyes to unfamiliar light filtering through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then I felt the warmth beside me, saw Nolan's dark hair against the pillow, and remembered everything. He was still asleep, his face peaceful in a way that made him look younger. One arm was still curved around me, and I could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing against my back. I lay there watching him, afraid to move and break whatever spell had carried us through the night. When he finally stirred, opening his eyes and focusing on my face with that slow recognition that comes with waking, I waited for his smile, for some acknowledgement of what had shifted between us. Instead, I saw something flicker across his expression, not regret exactly, but a kind of careful withdrawal that made my stomach tighten. "Good morning," he said, his voice hoarse with sleep. But he was already pulling back, creating space between us that hadn't been there when we fell asleep. I watched him get up and pull on a t-shirt from his dresser, his movements efficient and somehow distant. The easy intimacy of the night before seemed to evaporate in the morning light, replaced by something more guarded. He made breakfast while I sat at his kitchen table, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Watching him move around his apartment like I was a guest, he wasn't quite sure how to accommodate. He was polite, offering me coffee and asking how I'd slept, but there was a carefulness to his manner that hadn't been there in the darkness. I kept expecting him to reference what had happened between us, to acknowledge that something fundamental had changed. Instead, he talked about the weather, about his plans for the weekend, about anything except the fact that we'd spent the night wrapped around each other, finally admitting what we'd been dancing around for years. The breakfast was good, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, but made with the kind of attention that showed he cared about taking care of people. But I could barely taste it. I was too busy watching him, trying to understand what was happening behind his careful politeness. He wasn't cold exactly, just inward, like he was having an entire conversation with himself that I wasn't invited to join. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he found something else to focus on: his coffee mug, the newspaper, the dishes in the sink. After we finished eating, I helped him clean up, and we moved around each other in his small kitchen with the kind of choreographed politeness of people who were trying very hard not to touch accidentally. When I handed him a plate to dry, our fingers brushed, and he pulled away so quickly you'd have thought I'd burned him. When there was nothing left to clean, when we'd exhausted all the small talk about weather and weekend plans, I knew it was time to leave. The careful distance he'd been maintaining all morning made it clear that whatever courage had brought us together the night before had disappeared with the sunrise. I gathered my things slowly, hoping he might say something, might acknowledge what was happening between us. But he just watched me put on my coat, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his expression unreadable. At the door, I paused, waiting, hoping he might ask me to stay, might suggest we spend the day together, might give me some sign that last night had meant something to him beyond a moment of temporary weakness. But he said nothing. I turned to go, my hand on the doorknob, and something in me finally broke. Not with sadness, but with a kind of frustrated tenderness. I couldn't let him retreat into whatever fear was driving this careful distance. Not after everything we'd shared. You don't have to hide, I said, turning back to face him. Not from me. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw everything he'd been trying to keep contained. The fear, yes, but also the longing. The same need I'd been carrying around for years, reflected back at me in his eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with something that sounded like it might break him. I'm not hiding. I'm trying to decide if I'm brave enough to want this in the daylight too. The honesty of it, the raw vulnerability, made me take a step toward him, then another, until I was close enough to see the conflict playing out across his features, the war between what he wanted and what he thought he should want. Then let me help you want it, I said. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, slowly, like someone learning to trust their own hands, he reached for me. His arms came around me, tentative at first, then tighter, like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on. Stay, he whispered against my ear, and his voice cracked on the word. This time, I want you to stay. I pulled back just enough to see his face, to make sure he meant it. What I saw there was the same man who'd kissed me in the darkness, who'd held me while we slept, who'd been brave enough to admit he'd been thinking about kissing me. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, the decision to stop running from what we both wanted. I'm not going anywhere, I told him. And this time, I meant it as a promise. Time moves differently when you stop fighting it. Weeks passed, 6, maybe 7, and gradually the careful distance between wanting and having dissolved into something simpler. Something that felt like coming home. My toothbrush appeared beside his in the bathroom without either of us discussing it. First it was just for the nights I stayed over, which became most nights, which became all nights. Then it was my shampoo in his shower, my books mixed in with his on the bedside table, my coffee mug hanging next to his in the kitchen cabinet. Our shoes lined up by his front door like a small declaration of shared space. My camera bag claimed a corner of his living room. His spare key found its way onto my keychain. These small migrations happened so naturally that by the time I realized I was living there, it felt like I always had been. We still didn't talk much about what we were to each other. There were no grand declarations, no conversations about labels or the future. Instead, we learned each other in quieter ways. I discovered that he hummed while he cooked, that he read the news on his phone every morning before his feet hit the floor, that he saved funny videos throughout the day to show me when I got home from shoots. He learned that I left my socks in impossible places, that I could spend hours editing a single photograph until it felt right, that I had strong opinions about coffee and would make a face if he tried to serve me something that came from a pod. Everything about the way Nolan looked at me now said home. Not just his apartment, but something deeper, the kind of belonging that doesn't require explanation or justification. When I walked through the door each evening, his face would light up in a way that made my chest tight with gratitude. Like he'd been waiting all day for exactly that moment. One Tuesday night in late November, we were cleaning up after dinner. A simple pasta dish he'd learned to make from his grandmother, when he paused in his movements and leaned against the kitchen counter. He was holding a dish towel, his hair slightly mussed from the day, and there was something contemplative in his expression. I used to leave the door open because I didn't know how to say stay, he said quietly. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. It was the first time either of us had referenced those weeks of careful dancing, of him walking me to the door each night and telling me I probably shouldn't stay. only to leave it ajar like a question he couldn't quite ask. You don't have to say it anymore, I told him, smiling at the memory of how complicated we'd made something so simple. He set down the dish towel and walked over to where I stood by the sink. When he reached me, he lifted his hands to my face, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones in a gesture that had become familiar and precious. Then he pressed his forehead to mine, and we stood there breathing the same air, sharing the same space. I still mean it, he whispered. Every night. The words settled between us like a promise. Not just an invitation to stay for the evening, but something bigger, permission to stop leaving, to stop protecting ourselves from wanting this, to trust that what we'd built was strong enough to hold the weight of our love. I kissed him then, soft and certain, tasting the wine we'd shared with dinner and something sweeter underneath. When we pulled apart, he smiled, the kind of smile that reaches your eyes and stays there, the kind that makes you understand why people write songs about happiness. Later that night, after we'd finished cleaning up, after we'd watched half of a movie while curled together on his couch, after we'd brushed our teeth standing side by side at his bathroom sink, I watched him turn off the lights in the apartment. The last thing he did before we went to bed was check the front door. But instead of leaving it open, he turned the deadbolt and made sure it was securely closed. Then he paused, his hand still on the door, and looked back at me. No more leaving, he said simply. No more leaving, I agreed. In the darkness of his bedroom, our bedroom, we settled into sleep the way we'd learned to settle into everything else. Naturally, without overthinking, trusting that morning would find us still choosing each other. From the street, the apartment looked peaceful. The door was closed, but warm lights still glowed through the windows, steady and certain, like a lighthouse marking safe harbor.